What's up, guys? Miss Lilito here. Let's go ahead and take a look at multiplying rational numbers. So let's start with the general rules. So we know from our experience with multiplication thus far that anytime you multiply a positive number times a positive number, we are going to end up with a positive number. And I can prove this to you using that number line. So we have our example 4 times 3, which really means we have positive 4 3 times. So we can show that on our number line. So show positive 4 once, another, and a third time. And we end up at positive 12 on our number line. So we can use that same strategy to now help us figure out what a negative times a positive is, a negative times a negative, and a positive times a negative. So in our next example, a negative times a positive, or negative 4 times 3, this really means we have negative 4, or we're moving to the left 4 units 3 times. So starting at 0, we move to the left 4 units once, twice, and 3 times. And we end up at negative 12 on that number line. So a negative number times a positive number gives us a negative value. If we look at a positive times a negative, this is sort of the same as what we just looked at. So we have 4 times negative 3. This would be saying we're going to the right 4 units negative 3 times, or the opposite of 3 times. But we're going to use that commutative property that tells us that no matter what order we multiply in, we're going to get the same answer. So we know this is really the same as negative 3 times 4, which means we're going to the left 3 4 times. So let's show that. So we have the left 3 once, twice, 3, and 4 times, and we end up at negative 12. So negative 3 times 4 gives us negative 12, or gives us a negative product. So lastly, let's take a look at the example of a negative times a negative, or negative 4 times negative 3. So this is really saying we're going the opposite of 4, the opposite of 3 times. So we're looking at this really in the sense that we are going to the left 4 units, but we're doing this the opposite of 3 times. So we're now really going to the right 4 units 3 times. So we end up with positive 12. So a negative times a negative is really considered to be a positive number. To put some context to this to help it make sense, we can talk about a temperature falling some degrees. So we can say, for example, here that a temperature is falling 4 degrees for 3 hours. It started at 0, falling 4 degrees for 3 hours. So it went back 4 degrees for 3 hours. This example here would say our temperature is falling 4 degrees each hour, but we want to know what it was 3 hours ago. And if it's 0 degrees now, 3 hours ago, if it was falling 4 degrees, it was 4 degrees higher, 4 degrees higher, and 4 degrees higher. So as a general rule of thumb, a positive times a positive and a negative times a negative will result in a positive product, and a negative times a positive or a positive times a negative will result in a negative product. So anytime that you are asked to find the product of any positive and negative numbers, or rational numbers in general, the nice part is you can multiply the numbers as usual. So you're going to multiply them as you normally would. And to determine the sign of your answer, you are simply going to count the number of negative signs. So if we look at this first set of examples here, you'll notice there's 1 negative sign in the first problem, there's 1 in the second problem, and there's 3 in the third problem. These all have an odd number of negative signs. So let's see what happens when we have an odd number of negative signs. Well, we know from above that a negative times a positive is going to give us a negative number. So I always like to start, I know my answer is negative, I'll make a note of that. We can multiply those numbers as usual. So 3 times 11 is 33. But again, I know that in this case, my answer needs to be negative because I have a negative times a positive. So my answer is negative 33. Again, in this second one, I know a positive times a negative is also going to give me a negative answer. So I'm going to start by putting that negative sign there. And I can go ahead and multiply those answers as usual. 1 times 1 is 1, and 2 times 4 is 8. So my answer for this one would be negative 1/8. When I look at this last example, I'm going to start and break this down. So I'll start with negative 4 times negative 2. So we know from above that a negative times a negative gives us a positive answer. So 4 times 2 is 8, and since it's a negative times a negative, it's going to be positive 8. Well, now I need to multiply that by negative 3. And I know that a positive times a negative is going to give me a negative answer, so this final answer here is going to need to be negative. And I'll multiply as usual. 8 times 3 is 24, and our final answer is negative 24. So as a general rule of thumb, if there are an odd number of negative signs, 1, 1, or 3, there could be 5, there could be 11, there could be 21. But if there are an odd number of negative signs, we know the product is going to be negative. On the flip side of that, if there are an even number of negative signs, so 2, 4, 6, 8, we know the product will be positive. And again, we know that because we know from above that a negative times a negative gives us a positive. So again, we can look here. We have 2 negative signs, a negative times a negative. We know our answer is going to be positive. I like to note that just so I don't forget. And we can multiply as normal. 6 times 3 is 18. And again, we know this is going to be positive 18. Next example, again, I have a negative times a negative, so I know my answer is going to be positive. And I can go ahead and multiply these numbers as usual. Okay, 2 times 1 is 2. 4 times 1 is 4. Carry that 0. 2 times 2 is 4. 4 times 2 is 8. And I end up with 882. And it's going to be positive 8.82. And lastly, we take a look at this last example, and I see 1, 2 negative symbols here. Just to prove it, we can go through. We know a negative times a positive. Negative 5 times positive 2 will give us negative 10. And then if we multiply that by negative 4, a negative times a negative, we know is a positive 40. So we do know that our answer here should be positive, and that would be positive 40.